The air in the university hall buzzed with excitement as hundreds of business students held their breath. The dean stood at the podium, holding 3 envelopes that would change lives forever. And the finalists for this year's Henderson Innovation Fellowship are, he paused for effect, enjoying the tension, Priya Sharma, Tyler Chen, and Aisha Okafor. The crowd erupted in applause as the 3 students made their way to the stage, each trying to hide their shock behind professional smiles. They hadn't expected to make it this far. The Henderson Fellowship wasn't just any college competition, it was the golden ticket in the business world. $1 million in startup funding and personal mentoring from Victor Henderson himself, the founder of Henderson Tech and one of the richest people in the world. Priya clutched her hands together to stop them from shaking. Coming from a family that struggled to pay her tuition, this opportunity meant everything. Her business plan for affordable healthcare technology had been her obsession for 2 years. Next to her, Tyler adjusted his glasses with a confident smile. His family owned a small tech company, and coding had been his language since childhood. His app for sustainable supply chains could revolutionize how businesses operated. On the end stood Aisha, her bright yellow dress a stark contrast to the others' conservative outfits. A marketing genius with an uncanny ability to predict trends, her platform connecting small-scale farmers directly to consumers could transform food systems. "Congratulations," said a deep voice as a tall man approached from the side of the stage. The students froze. Victor Henderson rarely made public appearances, yet here he was, silver-haired, wearing a simple black sweater that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. His eyes were sharp but warm as he shook each student's hand. "I look forward to seeing which one of you has what it takes." That was 2 weeks ago. Now, the real competition had begun. Priya stared at her presentation slides in horror. Someone had changed her market analysis numbers, making her projections look wildly unrealistic. She had 30 minutes before her pitch to the Henderson Industries Board. Frantically, she tried to recover her backup files, but they were corrupted too. Down the hall, Tyler was having his own crisis. His prototype demonstration, which had worked perfectly that morning, kept crashing. It was as if someone had inserted a tiny error in his code, something that would take hours to find. In another room, Aisha discovered that the customized marketing materials she prepared for each board member were missing from her folder, replaced with generic printouts that made her look unprepared. None of them had time to fix everything. All they could do was adapt and move forward. After the presentations, they found themselves alone in the waiting room, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. "Interesting how your healthcare cost projections suddenly seemed so unrealistic," Tyler said to Priya with a raised eyebrow. "Almost as interesting as how your supposedly foolproof app kept glitching," Priya shot back. Aisha laughed bitterly. "At least you both had something to show. My materials mysteriously vanished." They glared at each other, the unspoken accusations hanging in the air. Each suspected the others of sabotage, and each was partly right. What they didn't notice was the small camera in the corner of the room, or that Victor Henderson was watching their interaction with great interest from his office. Over the next few days, the competition intensified. Priya accidentally spilled coffee on Tyler's laptop before an important simulation. Tyler spread rumors about flaws in Aisha's business model to potential investors. Aisha managed to access Priya's project files and leaked parts of her idea to a competitor. They were so focused on destroying each other that they barely noticed how Victor Henderson always seemed to be nearby, watching quietly, taking notes. Sometimes he would insert himself into conversations with challenging questions that left them stumbling. Other times he would pose hypothetical scenarios that forced them to reveal something about their values. "What would you do if your technology could help millions but harm thousands?" he asked Priya over lunch one day. How much profit would justify replacing human workers? He wondered aloud to Tyler during a tour of the labs. Would you delay a launch if you knew a competitor was suffering financially? He questioned Aisha during a mentoring session. The students gave the answers they thought he wanted to hear, never realizing they were being tested in ways they couldn't imagine. The cameras flashed as Priya, Tyler, and Aisha stood awkwardly side by side at the Henderson Industries charity gala. They wore forced smiles, dressed in their finest clothes. Priya in a borrowed blue dress, Tyler in a suit that had belonged to his father, and Aisha in a stylish outfit she'd stayed up all night altering to look more expensive than it was. "And here are our brilliant finalists," announced the host, a local TV personality who was trying too hard to seem interested. "Tell us, how does it feel to have the chance to work with Victor Henderson?" They gave rehearsed answers about honor and opportunity while shooting each other sideways glances. What the audience couldn't see was Tyler stepping slightly on Priya's dressed hem or Aisha subtly elbowing Tyler when he tried to speak over her. From across the room, Victor Henderson watched them, swirling a glass of sparkling water. Unlike most billionaires who loved the spotlight, Henderson seemed content to observe from the shadows. A thin man with thoughtful eyes and a quiet voice that somehow commanded attention, he rarely gave interviews and was known for his unexpected decisions. Some called him brilliant, others called him strange. Everyone agreed he was impossible to predict. "They're quite the fighters, aren't they?" said a woman beside him, Henderson's longtime assistant May. "Yes," Henderson replied. "But are they fighting for the right things? That's what I need to know." The next morning brought a new challenge. A full-day workshop where the finalists had to collaborate on a mock business proposal. The Henderson Industries boardroom became a battlefield. "That's not going to work," Tyler said, shooting down Priya's suggestion for the third time. "The numbers don't add up." "They would if you'd actually listened to my full explanation," Priya replied, her patience wearing thin. Aisha sighed loudly. "Both your approaches are too complicated. The judges will be bored 5 minutes in." By lunchtime, they had produced exactly nothing. In the cafeteria, Priya sat alone, picking at her salad and checking her phone. A text from her mother reminded her why she couldn't afford to lose this competition. Medical bills were piling up at home, and her scholarship barely covered her basic needs. Across the room, Tyler charmed a group of Henderson executives, dropping casual mentions of family connections. What they didn't know was that his family's company was struggling, and his parents had remortgaged their house to fund his education. This fellowship wasn't just an opportunity, it was his family's last hope. Meanwhile, Aisha was in the bathroom, splashing cold water on her face. The pressure was getting to her. She'd worked multiple jobs through college, fought harder than anyone to get here. Her business idea wasn't just about success, it was about proving wrong everyone who'd said she would never amount to anything. When they returned to the boardroom, they found Victor Henderson himself sitting at the table. "I thought I'd join you this afternoon," he said simply. The 3 students straightened up immediately, tension filling the room. Under Henderson's watchful eye, they managed to be civil, even productive. He didn't say much, just asked occasional questions that made them think deeper. By the end of the day, they had created a decent proposal, though none of them felt proud of how they'd behaved. As they gathered their things to leave, Henderson finally spoke up. "Tomorrow's challenge will be different. You'll each present your own vision for the future of technology. Not just products, but purpose." That night, alone in their provided apartments, each finalist faced their own doubts. Priya discovered that someone, likely Aisha, had leaked details about her presentation to online forums where people were already criticizing her ideas. Instead of fixing it, she stayed up researching Tyler's family company, looking for weaknesses she could exploit. Tyler found his project notes rearranged and realized Priya had been through his files. Rather than reporting it, he worked on a social media post that would subtly undermine Aisha's credibility. Aisha noticed unusual activity on her laptop and suspected Tyler had tried to hack her accounts. Her response was to prepare talking points that would make Priya's ideas seem unoriginal during tomorrow's Q&A. None of them slept well. None of them questioned whether this fellowship was bringing out the worst in them. And none of them realized that every move they made, every text, every search, every underhanded tactic was being recorded and analyzed by Henderson's security team. The next morning, as they prepared for their presentations, Henderson received a detailed report of their activities. He read it slowly, his expression unreadable. Then he picked up his phone and made a call. "Change of plans," he said quietly. "I think it's time for the next phase." The grand presentation hall of Henderson Industries was packed with journalists, investors, and curious onlookers. This was supposed to be the day one of the 3 finalists would edge ahead in the competition. Instead, it turned into a disaster for all of them. Priya went first. Her hands trembled slightly as she clicked to her first slide, but her voice was steady as she began describing her healthcare technology platform. 3 minutes in, the massive screen behind her glitched. Instead of her carefully prepared data, it showed private messages between her and a friend where she called Tyler an entitled rich kid and Aisha all style and no substance. The audience gasped. Priya froze, her face burning with humiliation. Technical difficulties, announced a Henderson staff member, rushing to fix the problem. Priya somehow finished her presentation, but the damage was done. Next came Tyler, confident despite what had happened to Priya. His app demonstration was going perfectly until he opened the user testing video. Instead of showing enthusiastic feedback, it played a compilation of Tyler practicing his pitch in his apartment, cursing each time he made a mistake, and at one point calling Priya's idea bleeding heart nonsense that'll never make money. The audience shifted uncomfortably in their seats. "I don't. That's not," Tyler stammered, his composure cracking. By the time Aisha took the stage, the atmosphere was painfully tense. She started strong, determined to avoid her competitor's fate. But halfway through her market analysis, her slides were replaced by screenshots of her search history, showing she'd been digging for dirt on both Priya and Tyler, along with searches like how to make someone's technology fail during demonstration. The live stream of the event was cut off abruptly. The 3 students stood in stunned silence as the audience filed out, whispering among themselves. None of the finalists could look at each other. Each suspected the others of the sabotage, not realizing they had all been exposed equally. Victor Henderson walked onto the stage, his expression unreadable. The students braced themselves for elimination, or worse, public humiliation. "Well," Henderson said quietly, "that was enlightening." "Mr. Henderson, I can explain," Priya began. He held up his hand. "No need. My car will pick you all up at 7 p.m. tonight. Pack for 2 days. We're going to my home." They exchanged confused glances. "Your home?" Tyler asked. "Is this part of the competition?" Aisha added. Henderson smiled slightly. "Let's call it the real competition. Everything up to now was just preliminary." With that, he walked off, leaving them bewildered. That evening, a sleek black car with tinted windows collected each student from their temporary apartments. No one spoke during the 2-hour drive that took them far from the city, deep into wooded countryside that grew increasingly remote. Finally, they turned onto a long private road that led to an enormous house perched on the edge of a cliff. It wasn't the flashy mansion they had expected, but something more tasteful, modern yet somehow timeless, with walls of glass reflecting the sunset. "Welcome," said Henderson, meeting them at the door himself. No staff was visible anywhere. "Leave your bags. We have dinner waiting." They followed him to a dining room where a table was set for 4. The meal was already laid out, simple but elegant food that none of them had the appetite to enjoy. "You must be wondering why you're here," Henderson said as he poured water for each of them, "especially after today's revelations." "Are you going to announce the winner?" Tyler asked hopefully. Henderson laughed softly. "After what I saw today, you think one of you deserves to win." Priya stared at her plate. "So this is to eliminate all of us at once?" "Not exactly," Henderson replied. "Tell me, in your searches and investigations of each other, did any of you look into me? Beyond the official biography?" The 3 exchanged glances. Henderson was famously private. There wasn't much to find. "I thought not," he continued. "You were so busy fighting each other that you never questioned what you were fighting for." He leaned forward. "Or who?" Aisha frowned. "What do you mean?" Henderson stood up. "Finish eating, then I'll show you." He checked his watch. "It's time you learned what this competition is really about." After picking at their food in uncomfortable silence, they'd followed Henderson through the house. He stopped at what appeared to be a blank wall, pressed his palm against it, and a hidden door slid open, revealing an elevator. "Going down?" he asked with a mysterious smile, gesturing them inside. The students hesitated, then stepped in one by one. "How far down does this go?" Priya asked as the door closed. "Far enough," Henderson replied, pressing the only button. far enough to change everything you think you know. The elevator descended for what felt like minutes, much longer than any basement should require. Pryor, Tyler, and Aisha exchanged nervous glances as the digital floor indicator kept dropping, -1, -2, -3, all the way to -7. Henderson stood calmly, hands clasped behind his back, watching their reflections in the polished metal doors. When the elevator finally stopped, the doors slid open to reveal something none of them had expected. Instead of a dark, cramped cellar, they stepped into what looked like the lobby of a futuristic research facility, bright, spacious, with gleaming white walls and floors that seemed to glow from within. "What is this place?" Tyler whispered, his eyes wide. Henderson smiled. "This is where I actually work. What the world sees, my company, my products, my public persona, that's just the surface." He led them down a wide corridor lined with glass walls. Behind each panel was something that made them stop and stare. Engineers working on what looked like floating holographic displays, plants growing at impossible speeds in a garden chamber, a material that changed color and texture as a scientist ran tests on it. "I don't understand," Pryor said, pressing her hand against the glass as she watched a tiny drone that seemed to be made of liquid metal reshape itself. "This technology is decades ahead of what's on the market," Henderson finished for her. "Yes." Aisha frowned. "But why keep it hidden? The profits would be enormous." Henderson nodded. "And that's exactly the problem." They continued walking, passing room after room of innovations that defied what they thought was possible. Henderson stopped at a large door and placed his palm on a scanner. "Before we go further, I need to know you understand what's at stake. Everything you see down here could change the world, but change isn't always good, and it's rarely simple." The door slid open to reveal a vast circular room. At its center stood a scale model of a city, but unlike any city they'd seen before. Miniature buildings rose from green spaces, connected by transparent tubes instead of roads. Tiny vehicles moved without visible pollution. The whole thing hummed with clean energy. "This is how we could live," Henderson said quietly. "Sustainable, efficient, in balance with nature instead of against it." "It's amazing," Pryor breathed. "Why isn't this already happening?" Henderson's expression darkened. "Because there are trillion-dollar industries that would collapse overnight. Because there are powerful people who prefer the world as it is, unequal, wasteful, but profitable for them." He walked them around the model, pointing out details. Energy that costs almost nothing to produce, transportation without fossil fuels, buildings that generate more power than they use, medicine that prevents disease instead of just treating symptoms. Tyler adjusted his glasses, examining everything with growing excitement. "You've solved all these problems already. This isn't theoretical." "Most of it works," Henderson confirmed. "Some needs refinement. All of it would disrupt the current power structure of our entire economy." Aisha crossed her arms. "So what does this have to do with your fellowship? With us?" Henderson turned to face them directly. "I need to decide which of these technologies to release first and how. It can't all happen at once, that would cause chaos. But it needs to happen before." He hesitated. "Before what?" Pryor asked. "Before I can't do it anymore." Henderson's voice had a new edge to it. "I don't have unlimited time." He led them to another door, which opened onto something unexpected, a comfortable living area with sofas, a kitchen, and what appeared to be bedrooms branching off a main space. "You'll stay here tonight," Henderson said. "Tomorrow, I'll show you more. Each of you will have access to different parts of the complex. You'll evaluate what you see, decide what you think should be prioritized and why." "This is the real competition," Tyler realized aloud. Henderson nodded. The fellowship was never about funding your startups. It was about finding someone who understands what's at stake, someone who can carry on when I can't. "Carry on what, exactly?" Aisha asked. "Making the right choices," Henderson said quietly. "Deciding which changes humanity is ready for, and which ones would do more harm than good if released too soon." They stood in silence, the weight of his words sinking in. "Get some rest," Henderson finally said, moving toward the elevator. Tomorrow will challenge everything you think you know about business, technology, and ethics. As the elevator doors closed behind him, the three students looked at each other. Competitors suddenly turned confidence in something much bigger than a simple business fellowship. "Did either of you have any idea?" Pryor whispered. Tyler shook his head. "Not a clue." "What have we gotten ourselves into?" Aisha wondered aloud. None of them had an answer, but all of them knew that after what they'd seen, nothing would ever be the same. Morning came without sunlight in the underground complex. Pryor woke to the gentle brightening of artificial lights designed to mimic dawn. For a moment, she forgot where she was until everything rushed back: the disastrous presentations, Henderson's invitation, and the mind-blowing technology they'd seen last night. In the common area, Tyler was already up, typing furiously on a tablet Henderson had left for them. Aisha joined them shortly after, her usual confidence replaced by thoughtful quiet. "Did either of you sleep?" Aisha asked, pouring coffee from a machine that had prepared it automatically at their waking. "Barely," Tyler admitted. "I kept thinking about that room with the quantum computers. If those work the way Henderson claims, they could crack every encryption system currently in use," Pryor finished. "Banking, government communications, everything." Before they could discuss further, the elevator doors opened and Henderson stepped out, looking refreshed despite the early hour. "I hope you rested well," he said. "Today, you'll each explore different sections of the complex. What you see may excite you, frighten you, or both. That's normal." He handed each of them a slim wristband. "These will guide you and grant you access. By the end of the day, I want your honest assessment of what you've seen." The three students separated, each following their wristband's directions through different corridors of the vast underground facility. Pryor found herself in a medical wing where researchers demonstrated regenerative treatments that could regrow damaged organs and extend human lifespans dramatically. A doctor showed her a simulation of how disease could be predicted and prevented years before symptoms appeared. "This could save millions of lives," the doctor explained, "but it would also transform society fundamentally. People living to 150 or beyond. Population growth without corresponding death rates. Healthcare systems completely restructured." Pryor watched in awe as cellular repair technology healed a severe wound in minutes. "Who decides who gets access to this?" she asked. "If only the wealthy can afford it." The doctor nodded grimly. "Exactly the question Mr. Henderson is wrestling with." Meanwhile, Tyler toured energy systems that could provide nearly free power to the entire planet. A scientist demonstrated a battery the size of a shoebox that could power a small town for a year. "We could end energy poverty overnight," the scientist said. "But the economic disruption would be massive. Entire countries whose economies depend on oil and gas would collapse." Tyler frowned. "There must be a way to transition gradually." The scientist shrugged. "That's the challenge. By the time a gradual approach filters down to those who need it most, it might be too late for our climate." In another section, Aisha examined communication technology that could connect people without intermediaries. No corporations, no government surveillance, no centralized control. "Absolute privacy and free information exchange," explained her guide. "But the same technology that protects human rights activists from oppressive regimes would also shield criminals and terrorists." As the day progressed, each student filled digital notebooks with observations and questions. The excitement of seeing such innovations was increasingly tempered by the weight of their implications. By evening, they reunited in the central chamber with the city model, where Henderson waited for them. Their faces showed the strain of what they'd witnessed. "Now you understand," Henderson said softly. "Every solution creates new problems. Every advancement has consequences." "Why show this to us?" Pryor asked. "We're just students." Henderson sat down heavily. "Because I'm dying." The stark admission hung in the air. "Despite all this technology," he continued, "some things remain beyond our reach. I have perhaps a year left, and someone needs to continue this work to make the hard decisions about what humanity is ready for." Tyler looked stunned. "That's why the fellowship exists? To find your replacement?" "One person can't do this alone," Henderson replied. "It's too much responsibility for any single individual." He gestured to the model city. "I've spent my life building this. Now I need people I can trust to carry it forward." But why us? Aisha asked. After how we behaved, trying to sabotage each other. Henderson smiled faintly. Because despite your competitiveness, each of you showed something important in your applications, your ideas, your values. Something I couldn't find in one person alone. What was that? Pryor asked. You'll see, Henderson said. Tomorrow, I want each of you to present your recommendations, which technologies to release first, which to hold back, and why. Be honest. There are no right answers, only thoughtful ones. As they returned to their quarters, the three former rivals found themselves talking not as competitors, but as colleagues facing an impossible challenge. What did you see? Tyler asked Aisha. Things that could heal the world or tear it apart, she replied. You. The same, Pryor said quietly. The exact same. None of them slept that night. How could they? The weight of what Henderson had shown them, what he was asking them to do, kept their minds racing until dawn. They gathered in a conference room the next morning, each clutching tablets filled with notes and recommendations. Henderson sat at the head of the table, looking tired but alert, his eyes taking in their exhausted faces. Who would like to begin? He asked simply. Pryor stood first. Her hands shook slightly as she pulled up a presentation. I focused on the medical technologies, she began. The ability to cure previously untreatable diseases could save millions of lives immediately, but the life extension treatments are more complicated. She showed a chart she'd created overnight. If we release these gradually, starting with treatments for children with terminal illnesses, we could avoid the worst social disruptions while still helping those in most need. Henderson nodded thoughtfully. And the cost? These treatments would be expensive at first. That's why I suggest partnering with global health organizations, Pryor replied. Make it available based on need, not ability to pay. Tyler raised his hand. But production capacity would be limited at first. How do you decide which sick children get treatment? A lottery system, Pryor answered. It's not perfect, but it's fair. When Pryor finished, Tyler took his turn. He'd spent hours analyzing the energy technologies, and his engineering background showed in his detailed rollout plan. The small-scale power cells should come first, he explained, bringing up diagrams of the shoebox-sized batteries they'd shown him. We start with disaster relief and remote communities without electricity. That builds public goodwill without threatening energy markets too suddenly. Aisha frowned. But that approach might take decades to reach everyone. Climate change won't wait. True, Tyler acknowledged. But if we crash the global energy economy overnight, the resulting chaos could be worse than climate change itself. They debated back and forth, challenging each other's assumptions and refining their ideas. Unlike their previous competitions, there was no undercutting or sabotage, just three minds wrestling with genuinely difficult problems. When it was Aisha's turn, she tackled the communications technology. The privacy system is revolutionary, but it needs safeguards, she explained. I propose releasing it first to human rights organizations and journalists in dangerous regions. Won't governments just ban it? Pryor asked. They'll try, Aisha admitted. But this technology is designed to be unblockable. Once it exists, it exists. The question is whether we guide its introduction or let it happen chaotically. Hours passed as they discussed, argued, and built on each other's ideas. Sometimes Henderson would interject with a question or comment, but mostly he observed, making notes of his own. As lunchtime approached, something unexpected happened. The three students, who had been trading the floor back and forth, began to work together. Tyler started expanding on Pryor's medical distribution plan. Pryor pointed out connections between Aisha's communication rollout and her healthcare initiative. Aisha suggested ways to use Tyler's energy technology to power the medical facilities Pryor wanted to build in underserved regions. Without realizing it, they moved from individual presentations to collaborative planning, their separate tablets soon abandoned for the room's shared display. They'd forgot Henderson was watching as they sketched out a comprehensive approach that drew on all their strengths. What if we coordinate these three technologies? Tyler suggested excitedly. Use the communication system to identify needs, the energy cells to power treatment centers, and the medical eye to train local healthcare workers remotely, Pryor finished. We could reach places that have been completely overlooked. and use successful initial projects to build public support for wider implementation, as she added. People need to see this working in real communities first. Henderson cleared his throat, reminding them of his presence. All three turned, suddenly self-conscious about their enthusiasm. "I think," Henderson said with the first genuine smile they'd seen from him, "we should break for lunch. You've been at this for 5 hours straight." 5 hours? Aisha checked her watch in disbelief. Henderson nodded. "And you didn't even notice." He stood looking at them with something new in his expression, approval, perhaps even hope. "When you come back, I have something important to show you. One last part of the complex you haven't seen yet." As they filed out, Pryor realized something had fundamentally changed. They'd arrived as competitors, each determined to win at the other's expense. Now they were building something together, something bigger than any of them could have created alone. "What do you think the last part is?" Tyler asked quietly as they walked to the dining area. "I don't know," Pryor replied. "But I think we're ready for it." Aisha nodded. Together, anyway. After lunch, Henderson led them to an elevator different from the one they'd used before. This one required not only his palm print, but also a retinal scan and voice confirmation. Whatever lay beyond these doors was clearly his most closely guarded secret. "Before we go down," Henderson said, his hand hovering over the final authorization button, "I want you to understand something. What you've seen so far represents the future, technologies that could transform our world. What I'm about to show you explains the why." The elevator descended even deeper than they'd gone before. When the doors opened, they found themselves in a space that felt more like a home than a laboratory. Warm lighting, comfortable furniture, and walls lined with actual paper books, a stark contrast to the sleek technology of the upper levels. In the center of the room stood a holographic display unlike anything they'd seen. It showed Earth, slowly rotating, with countless data points flowing across its surface. "This is the heart of everything," Henderson said quietly. "My life's work." He gestured toward the display, and the view zoomed in to show weather patterns, ocean temperatures, pollution levels, and dozens of other environmental measures. 30 years ago, I developed an advanced predictive model," Henderson explained, "more detailed and accurate than anything governments or universities had. It showed our planet was heading toward environmental collapse faster than anyone realized." The display shifted to show projections, rising seas, extreme weather, failing crops, mass migrations. "I was just a young engineer then, with a small tech startup," Henderson continued. "No one would listen, so I decided to do something about it myself. I built my company not for profit, but for purpose, to develop technologies that could help us avoid the worst outcomes." Pryor moved closer to the display, her eyes wide. "These predictions, they're happening now, aren't they? The floods, the fires, the crop failures." Henderson nodded solemnly. "Yes, we're already seeing the early stages, but it's not too late to change course. That's why the underground complex," Tyler realized aloud. "You weren't hiding from competitors. You were racing against time." "Exactly," Henderson confirmed. "And now time is running out, both for our planet and for me personally." He guided them to a conference table in the corner of the room, where 3 folders waited. Inside each folder is a legal document. I've established a foundation with enough resources to continue this work for decades. I'm offering each of you a position as a trustee." The 3 students exchanged stunned glances. "Not one winner," Aisha said slowly. "All of us." "Yes," Henderson smiled. "What you demonstrated upstairs today confirmed what I suspected when I chose you as finalists. Pryor, your compassion and focus on helping the vulnerable. Tyler, your technical brilliance and systematic thinking. Aisha, your understanding of human behavior and how to guide social change. Together, you make a team that can do what no individual could." He opened his own folder. The competition was never about finding a single successor. It was about finding balance, different perspectives that could challenge and strengthen each other. "But we tried to sabotage each other," Pryor said, guilt evident in her voice. "We behaved terribly." "And then you learned," Henderson replied simply. "When faced with problems bigger than yourselves, you set aside your differences and worked together. That's exactly what humanity needs to do." Tyler opened his folder, scanning the documents with growing amazement. This is incredible. The resources, the responsibility. It's also a burden, Henderson said frankly. You'll have to make difficult choices. There will be pressure from governments, corporations, individuals, all wanting these technologies for their own purposes. How do we know we'll make the right decisions? Aisha asked. Henderson's expression softened. You don't. No one does. That's why I'm not entrusting this to one person with a single perspective. Together, you'll check each other's blind spots. You'll debate, argue, and ultimately find better solutions than any of you could alone. He stood up, walking back to the Earth display. I didn't build all this to become wealthy or famous. I built it because I believe humanity deserves a chance, not just to survive, but to thrive in balance with our planet. The three students joined him, watching the blue-green world slowly turn. So what happens now? Pryor asked quietly. Now, Henderson replied, you finish your degrees. You learn everything you can about your fields, and you prepare for the work ahead. The foundation will provide for your education and anything else you need. And the technologies? Tyler asked. We'll begin implementing your combined plan, Henderson said, starting small, as you suggested, building momentum, using success in one area to fuel progress in others. They stood together in silence for a moment, the weight of the future settling on their shoulders, no longer as a competition, but as a shared purpose. I have one condition, Henderson added finally. That you remember how this began, with each of you fighting to win at the other's expense, and how it transformed when you recognized that some challenges are too big for individual ambition. Aisha nodded, a reminder that we're stronger together than apart. Exactly, Henderson smiled. Now, shall we go back upstairs and get to work? We have a world to save. As they returned to the upper levels, the three former rivals found themselves planning not for personal glory, but for a future bigger than themselves, a future they would build together, one careful decision at a time.